next little step in my video series on using Rule Zero in tabletop role-playing games as it needs to be by a good GM. So, as is typical, the recap. Rule Zero is Dungeon Master discretion, Game Master's call, however you want to say it, is that the GM has the final word when it comes to rules decisions. So we went over using it to control pace. We've discussed using it to fit your theme. But another big thing is your discretionary use. And this is where most people get into kind of the meat and potatoes of Rule Zero is making those calls on the fly as a dungeon master or as a game master, and how you use them to influence game. Now, one expression that I've heard lately, you see this in a lot of forums and whatnot, and this is one that I really hate, and that is you have somebody who brings up an idea that a party comes up with, players come up with a way to combine spells or to put things together. This isn't necessarily a ruling decision on a pure mechanical level, like what pluses or minuses you're going to give on a roll, but this is more along the lines of the rulings that you make. And the expression that I've seen come up that I'm really not a fan of is, well, that seems like it's overpowered, so I'm not going to allow it at my table. That seems exploitative, so I'm not going to allow it at my table. And to me, that discourages your players from thinking outside the box and being more creative in the way they use their abilities. And there's a very nasty unintended consequence to that. When you start making calls based on what you think might be overpowered and just arbitrarily ruling, hey, this isn't going to work, what you end up doing on the back end is training your players to not be outside of the meta, so to speak. So we have the ways certain spells, certain abilities get used in different games, and that's kind of the way they're supposed to be used. And they're a little unbalanced, so people tend to abuse them a little bit. You can make little adjustments with home rules and stuff to balance those out. But when players come up with really creative ways to do things, you've got to be a little bit more free with that, because that's where your quote-unquote underpowered classes, where your bad classes tend to shine in these games, especially if you're in a class-based system. If your player finds a creative way to use a skill that is generally seen as less useful, or an ability that is generally seen as less useful, by encouraging that creativity and trying to find ways other than just saying, oh, that's broken, or I don't think that's the way that should be used, finding ways to deal with it other than that is how you encourage them to continue trying to think outside the box without penalizing the game. So the example that I had come to mind here lately was actually in a D&D for Beginners Facebook group, and they were talking about it as a meme that was posted, and the first player says, okay, I'm going to cast Insect Swarm 200 feet over the head of these enemies. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and say 30 feet, because that's where the spell description actually says, so that we can cut out the whole, well, it wouldn't work because the second spell only has a 30-foot range. So we're just going to say it's in range. It's not important. But the meme says 200 feet. And then the second player, who's a druid, says, well, I'm going to use the animal shape ability, or the animal shape spell, to turn all of these insects into rhinoceri, and these rhinos are going to fall on the bad guys. And then the DM's like, oh my god. And you had somebody in the comment section, I wouldn't allow this in my game because that's overpowered. That seems like it's game broken, so I just wouldn't allow that because, That would take away all the other players would just get to sit there and watch them rhino storm everybody all the time. I picked this out as a very bad example of using Rule Zero. This is a DM who has come in and said, hey, I've got a problem here. They've come up with a really creative way to use these two spells together, and mechanically it works because it's really the way both spells are written, it really does function. And I'm just going to say, no, it's OP, rather than find a real way to make it work, or a reason why it doesn't work, or some other reason why you wouldn't want to do it. And following with that example, it's like, okay, sure, those spells would work together like that. But there's a couple of ways around it. You could make an argument where you say that insects lack the necessary intelligence to be quote-unquote a willing target. That's one way you could do it. Only problem you come across there is when you see that an animal or a beast, whatever they're calling it in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, because that's where the example came from, has a 2 intelligence, and there's insects with a 2 intelligence. It's like, well, damn, they can't really use that argument. But that's not the only way around it. I look at that one, and in Dungeons & Dragons, druids have to respect, whether they're evil, good, neutral, whatever, they still have to respect life. The natural order is super important to druids. And you may be able to summon a bear to fight for you, but my ruling as a DM would be, I'm looking at it, and I agree with the guy who posted the solution. Yeah, you got a guy who's exploiting something and making a super overpowered spell combination. I've got to fix this somehow. But it's not to just say, oh, because I think that's overpowered, I'm not going to allow it. My solution would be, okay, fine, it works. It's going to work kind of like a falling rock trap. You got cows, they're not as hard as a stone, obviously, or you got rhinos, they're not as hard as a stone, obviously, but they're still big, they're still heavy. You can only be hit by so many of them because of their size. They're falling 30 feet. Let's just call it 10 die 6 with a reflex save for half or a dex save for half, because that's about what a falling rock trap would be. Yeah, spell works. Crushes their enemies. Sees them driven before you. Hears the lamentation of their women. All that good stuff. All right, Druid, now it's time for some atonement. What do you mean it's time for atonement? It's time for atonement. Druid abilities are gone. Why are your Druid abilities gone? Well, because you just decided that the proper way to respect nature and to have feeling and empathy for these creatures is to drop them on people from 30 feet and break their legs and necks. You may as well have loaded a cow into a trebuchet. This is not respectful of nature. This is an abuse of your gifts and your power. Regardless of how you have your druid set up, that is outside the bounds of that class. Now you're having to go for atonement. Now you have penalties. And that is within the game rules. Now all of a sudden it's like, no, I'm not going to do the rhino drop every time we have combat, because I'm going to have to be going on atonement quests and losing half my abilities all the time because I decided to be a jackass and basically use animals as cannon fodder. So you can see that both places, the needed impact is there. Hey, I don't need you using the insect swarm rhino drop as a way to wipe out orcs or resolve a situation. On one hand, I can say I'm going to use my rule 0 to just say that's OP, it's not allowed. On the other hand, I can say, fine, it works because you use the creativity. I'm encouraging you to use your brain to figure out how your abilities can work in conjunction in creative and inventive ways, and that'll be great. But because you decided to do something that is arbitrary, that is like just objectively against the principles of what your character is supposed to be, you've now lost your abilities. There's penalties for that. Both are a use of Rule 0. Both are a use of the GM making a call to say how how things are going to go at the table, and both are going to discourage the behavior of using that spell combo. But one punishes the character, the other is punishing the player. And you don't want to punish the player, you want to punish the character. That way, you don't end up in a situation where you get, and this is another example I've heard. I'm actually pilfering this idea from from Seth Swarkowski, who's one of my favorite tabletop role-playing game YouTubers. He told a story about how some players use the wall of force to create like a bubble with a hole in one side, and then cast a delayed blast fireball inside of it so that they could hold it up to a lock and essentially make a shaped charge. I had a similar instance where somebody used a cone of force to basically make a funnel, and they cast fireball inside of it to make like a cutting torch, or like make almost like a laser beam. That was many, many years ago. You don't discourage those kind of things where somebody tries to find great ways to manipulate different abilities because they don't feel like the DM is just going to look at them and say, nope, that's not allowed. This is how you should think about Rule Zero when it comes to those not mechanics, but game rule situations ruling as a GM. You want to think, how can I work within this without penalizing them for paying attention to their abilities and being creative, and without being arbitrary? I'm just deciding this doesn't work because I've decided this is OP and I didn't think about it. How do we do this in a manner where they're rewarded for their creativity, but they find out you better think about the consequences at the same time? Maybe there's another way to do this. Maybe we find a way to make something else work. Or any number of other different ways that you can make the situation work without having to penalize your player for creativity. So that's the next thing when you're using Rule Zero. Be very conscious that you don't have the knee-jerk reaction to simply disallow something or to just say something works without really a good reasoning behind it and penalizing your player's creativity. But penalize the character for not thinking about consequences. Find other reasons that are just as rational that this can have a negative consequence. Same example. Maybe your game master, your DM in that 5e Dungeons & Dragons scenario, maybe they look at it and they're like, you know what, these rhinoceroses and stuff like that is not a big overuse, or I don't want to penalize them so bad that they have to do atonement or something like that. Well, if you go back and you read that spell, they last until they're basically damaged to the point of being unconscious. Let's say that half of them, and we just roll, however many rhinos we have up there, which, let's just say there's 50 of them. We're just going to roll a D20. D20 of them are going to revert back to insects, and then we're going to roll another D20, and another D20 are going to be injured, and then there's going to be some that are just ticked off. Well, animal shape doesn't say you get to tell them what to do. They behave in the way the animal does. Well, now you got a pack of charging rhinos coming at your party. This is something they can possibly avoid, they can get around. But it's like, you know what, maybe we don't do the rhino airdrop again, because last time we did the rhino airdrop, we ended up playing Matador with a horde of angry rhinos, and they Mufasa'd our fighter. Maybe the rampaging horde of Cape Buffalo wasn't the best idea. Think about it outside the box that way, so that you reward their creativity, you allow them the fruits of their labor, but you make them think about other things too. Now you've got players who are really trying to develop things, and this is also how you end up not having the same party all the time, where people try to do new things, and when I say new things, I mean real new things, where they play that class that the players who tend to think about this as a video game on tabletop are really thinking of new ways to use skills that they never would have before. That's all I got for you today. Like, comment, and subscribe. I hope to hear more from you, and everybody just have a good day.